how do you specifically view the Pacific theater, the American-Japanese Pacific War, in the whole context of the demise of empires?
The war between Japan and the United States is it's one which is often in general history of the war played down. Not enough attention is paid to it. I mean, there was a long-term rivalry between Japan and the United States in the Pacific. And for a long time, the Japanese have been thinking, what will it be like when we go to war with America? I mean, a long time, from the end of the First World War. The United States, too, a long period during which Japan was perceived to be a potential threat. That goes back even before the First World War. So there's a background, if you like, to that conflict, which is independent of the rise of Japanese imperialism. But Japanese imperialism, clearly in the end is a challenge to America's position in the Pacific. It's a challenge to American interests. It's a challenge to America's principle of free trade and free use of the oceans and so on and so on. So a clash, I think, was almost inevitable. The difference was the Japanese government in Tokyo, because it desperately wanted an empire, and it wanted an empire which the United States did not intervene. But they could see that the difficulty of building an empire like that without, at some point having to confront the United States, and that's the Pacific War. The Pacific War is to protect the empire, to build a periphery which the Americans would either lack the will or the means to be able to penetrate. And that's the Pacific War. And the Japanese misjudged it entirely. Roosevelt was strongly opposed to the new wave of imperialism, whether it was Mussolini or Hitler or the Japanese, and he made every effort in the Pacific to try and limit what the Japanese, contain the Japanese. It couldn't be done, but then America united to destroy the Japanese empire, which they did, fundamentally.
Well, why couldn't the Japanese have attempted to create a Pacific empire and not having attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor, or at least waited until they consolidated an empire in the Pacific?
Pearl Harbor, most historians agree that Pearl Harbor is in some ways a strategic mistake. It didn't achieve anything very much in military terms, and it succeeded in uniting the American public, which was deeply divided on the issue of going to war. But, if they'd not attacked Pearl Harbor, but had seized the resources of Malaya and Indonesia, I think that would have almost certainly pushed Roosevelt to declare war against the Japanese. He's almost at a point of war with the sanctions and so on. But if the Japanese carried on into Southeast Asia, threatened the Philippines and Australia, I find it difficult to see how Roosevelt could have resisted the pressure for war.